Our gospel reading this morning comes from the Gospel of Luke, chapter 24, verses 1 through 12. But on the first day of the week at early dawn, they came to the tomb, taking the spices that they had prepared. They found the stone rolled away from the tomb, but when they went in, they did not find the body. While they were perplexed about this, suddenly two men in dazzling clothes stood beside them. The women were terrified and bowed their faces to the ground, but the men said to them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead? He is not here, but has risen. Remember how he told you while he was still in Galilee that the Son of Man must be handed over to sinners and be crucified, and on the third day rise again." Then they remembered his words, and returning from the tomb, they told all this to the 11 and to all the rest. Now it was Mary Magdalene, Joanna, Mary the mother of James, and the other women with them who told this to the apostles. But these words seemed to them an idle tale, and they did not believe them. But Peter got up and ran to the tomb. Stooping and looking in, he saw the linen cloths by themselves. Then he went home amazed at what had happened. This is the word of the Lord. Thanks be to God. In Oliver Jeffers' children's book, The Heart and the Bottle, we meet a little girl whose endless curiosity about the world is fueled by her father. He goes outside with her at night and shows her the constellations. He introduces her to the wonders of the sea. He reads her books about plants and animals and all kinds of adventures. And the girl delights in discovering new things. But then one day she discovers that her father is gone. Where he used to sit and read to her, there is only an empty chair. The little girl's grief is overwhelming. She doesn't know how to handle it, and so to escape the pain, she puts her heart in a safe place, a glass bottle, which she hangs around her neck. This is a good strategy, at least at first, but in truth, nothing is the same. She forgets about the stars and stops taking notice of the sea. In fact, she doesn't take much notice of anything around her as she becomes less and less curious about the world and more distracted by the challenge of living with a heavy, awkward bottle around her neck, keeping her heart safe from the pain of the world. Death is fundamentally disorienting. Its finality and suddenness changes us, and it is almost always experienced as sudden, even when we know it is coming. After an encounter with death, we are exceptionally good at creating tombs, places where we seal away our pain and grief so we can get on with life. But like the girl in the story, we quickly discover that it's hard to engage in life. It's hard to embrace life fully when we are working so hard to protect ourselves and others. Fortunately, the God we are here to worship this Easter Sunday is in the business of opening and emptying tombs, giving life to what we have given up for dead. Even though Jesus kept telling his followers that his death was coming, they weren't prepared for it when it happened, and they could hardly stand to watch. The only ones who stayed through the bitter end were the women, the same women who showed up first thing that morning, the day after the Sabbath, to do the work of tending to Jesus' body, to anoint it with spices and perfumes. But when they arrived, the tomb was open and the body was gone. It made no sense. These women had stayed with Jesus until the end. They knew he was really and truly dead when his body was placed in that tomb. They felt all the pain and the bitterness. They had looked the tragedy of Jesus' senseless death right in the eye. We know all about the tragedy of senseless death, terror attacks, school shootings, cancer. Sometimes it feels like senseless death is all there is. And if senseless death is all we know, then we have to do everything we can to protect ourselves and our loved ones, to avoid death at all cost. John Updike once wrote, "Each day we wake slightly altered, and the person we were yesterday is dead. So why be afraid of death when death comes all the time?" When the women came to the tomb early that morning, they were not afraid of death. In fact, they were looking for Jesus' dead body. They knew what to do with that, how to use the spices and perfumes to hide the smell, how to offer Jesus that final dignity. They came looking for death, not life. And the last thing they expected to find was an empty tomb. Yet there it was. The stone moved away, the tomb empty, and two angels who gently scolded them, "Why do you look for the living among the dead?" And then jogged their memories. "Remember how he told you this would happen?" So they ran back to tell the others they had discovered something other than death at Jesus' tomb, something like the possibility of life. The resurrection life Jesus told them was coming, but the others they told, Jesus' disciples, they had not stayed until the end. In their grief and disorientation over Jesus' death, they had locked themselves away. They couldn't handle the pain, couldn't comprehend what it meant that their beloved teacher had been killed. When Jesus died, their hopes and expectations about their future died as well, so they sealed them away like Jesus' body in the tomb. So when the women told them what they had seen, the disciples immediately dismissed it as, well, the Bible says, as an idle tale, but that is a sanitized translation of a much stronger phrase. They dismissed the women's claim as hogwash, utter garbage, sheer lunacy. But something about the women's story gets under their skin. And the disciple Peter, the one who staunchly defended and vehemently denied Jesus in his last days, he runs to the tomb to see for himself. And when he sees that all that's left there is a piece of linen, his heart stirs, his imagination is awakened. Standing there in the tomb, holding Jesus' grave clothes, he begins to imagine the possibility of new life in the midst of death. Every instinct we have tells us that this Easter story of Jesus' resurrection is nothing more than an idle tale, a ridiculous fantasy, but still it has gotten under our skin. Isn't that why we're all here? Haven't we come here today longing to find the living among the dead, longing to hear a story that isn't just about something that happened over 2,000 years ago, but that might just be true for us today, too? After years of studying people who have endured unspeakable suffering, psychologists have identified a phenomenon called post-traumatic growth. Many people who've experienced trauma, including the sudden and unexpected death of a loved one, later report enhanced relationships, greater self-acceptance, and a heightened appreciation for life. David Kushner witnessed this in his own family when his brother was murdered at the age of 11. The idea that this tragic loss could lead to growth was simply unimaginable when it first happened to David and his family. Our focus, he writes, was on surviving the horror of it. But over time, something shifted. In a journal entry written years later, David's father wrote, "After you've understood that the death cannot be undone, that you will continue to live, the question becomes, what shall I do with the rest of my life?" After that first Easter morning, the women and Peter and the rest of the disciples will walk away from the empty tomb, still wondering just what it could all mean. But in a few days' time, they will see Jesus again, and the first thing he will do is show them his scars. The resurrected Jesus is not some kind of superhero for whom all the evidence of death and suffering has been wiped away, undone. This is an utterly human Jesus whose body bears the scars of crucifixion. New life for the resurrected Jesus is not about erasing what has gone before, the betrayal, the suffering, the death. That all happened. Suffering and death was real for Jesus. It is real for us. And that means the resurrection is not something confined to one-time event over 2,000 years ago, not something we just gather today to memorialize and commemorate. We celebrate today because resurrection is still happening, still transforming suffering and death in all kinds of ways. This is God's promise, that again and again, in places where we think there is only death, God reveals new life. World Vision is the largest Christian NGO in the world, responding immediately and effectively to crises of all kinds. But World Vision doesn't stop at crisis management. Their goal is always to effect real and lasting change, and it's working. In a recent email to donors, the organization shared some of their many success stories. 30 years ago, Ethiopia's Ansokya Valley was called the Valley of the Shadow of Death because of the mass graves there filled with bodies of those who had starved to death during the drought. Today, that landscape has more than 20 million new trees and acres of farmland, producing incredible yields of drought-resistant crops. Capped springs have brought clean water, increasing irrigated land by more than 700%. Primary school enrollment has soared. In the 1980s, the people of Peru were mired in a fight against terrorism. The terrorist group, the Shining Path, had sparked a conflict that lasted for 12 years and killed nearly 70,000 civilians. Today, after cooperation with the government and much community development work, there's a new generation of leaders leading the people to a peaceful future. For the last 30 years, ending poverty has been on every NGO and government's priority list. Nations and nonprofits around the world have worked to solve a problem many said could never be solved. But in the last 30 years, the percentage of the world's population living in extreme poverty has decreased from 52% to 21%. William Sloane Coffin once wrote that an Easter faith says we live in an Easter, not a Good Friday world. It says you can kill God's love, but you cannot keep it dead and buried. The girl from that book, The Heart and the Bottle, grows into a woman trapped in the past, stuck in grief over the loss of her father. One day she encounters another girl, this one still young and filled with endless curiosity, and the woman remembers the child she once was. And suddenly she realizes all that she lost when she locked her heart away. So she tries everything she can to free her heart from that bottle. But after all this time, the bottle is impenetrable. It cannot be broken. For a moment, the woman thinks it is too late. Her heart cannot be freed. Until the little girl still curious and small, takes that bottle and puts her little hand right through the narrow opening to remove the woman's heart and put it back in her chest. The woman's father is still gone, but her life is no longer defined by loss. Now she is inspired by all that her father taught her to live once more with wonder and curiosity about the world around her, to engage in life fully, and to delight in all things new. No matter what deaths we have endured, no matter what suffering we have known, no matter how impenetrable the walls we put up to protect ourselves, God will stop at nothing. To roll the stone away from the tomb, to unlock the door, to break down the walls around our hearts, to free us from death for new life. We live in an Easter world, a world defined not by death, but by resurrection, which is not just life after death, but life made new, life transformed in spite of and because of the suffering and death we have known. Amen.